Para começar os trabalhos, eu gostaria de convidar o professor Stuart Phillips para se juntar a mim aqui no palco virtual do Gatorade Brasil. Eu vou deixar de compartilhar a minha tela. So, Stuart, welcome to the virtual stage of the GSSI Brazil webinar. It's a great pleasure to have you here. If you can, unmute and perhaps share your screen. And it's a great pleasure. I mean, we are all very happy and excited that you accepted the invitation to be here with us tonight. And we look forward to your presentation.
Muito obrigado, Orlando. I'd like first to say thank you to Orlando and all of the organizers for the invitation to speak this evening. It's truly an honor. I wish it could be in person. Brazil, as I'm sure a lot of you know, is one of my favorite countries to visit, and it's a shame I'm not there, but hopefully this will be okay. So the title of the talk is the protein consumption and resistance exercise to maximize anabolic potential. There's some disclosures that I'm making on this slide for people that have funded the work that we've done over the last few years. And I just want to state that any opinion or scientific interpretation expressed in this presentation are those of myself and do not necessarily reflect the position or policy of PepsiCo Incorporated. The simplest analogy I can give you for how proteins turn over in your body, and specifically I'm referring to muscle, is that of a brick wall. Bricks are put into the wall and bricks are taken out of the wall if they're damaged. This persistent and ongoing turnover of, in the case of muscle, amino acids going into and amino acids being removed from muscle provides a mechanism that keeps muscle in its most optimal state. The question I'm asking then is, what are the main drivers or things that even impede the rate of muscle protein synthesis or amino acids going into the wall? The figures on this slide are from a publication from Philip Atherton in the United Kingdom, where he has subjects ingesting a large amount of whey protein. You can see rises in amino acids here, including rises in the intramuscular, within the muscle, amino acids. And we get a stimulation of muscle protein synthesis that's quite transient. It lasts only about an hour and a half. When you look at this in a schematic form, it looks something like this. There are two processes, muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown, that are stimulated and suppressed respectively every time we consume a protein-containing meal. You can see a robust stimulation of muscle protein synthesis, a suppression of muscle protein breakdown, and the green area then represents the amount of muscle protein that's gained. However, we don't eat all the time, and for a period after we've consumed our first meal, there's an area of gray which represents a loss of muscle protein. This is where protein breakdown exceeds protein synthesis until we eat our midday meal and we get a subsequent stimulation. We go for a period without eating until we eat our later meal, and then we get another stimulation of muscle protein synthesis. And you can see these green periods are approximately the same size as the gray periods, and so our muscle mass is maintained. In the situation then when we add exercise to the condition, you can see that in the fed state, with the addition of exercise, compared to the fed state alone, that you get a stimulation of muscle protein synthesis that persists. In other words, exercise potentiates or adds to the effect of amino acid feeding. So each time we now consume protein, you get an extra stimulation and a greater area of muscle protein gain and a smaller area of muscle protein loss. When you look at all the green areas, you can see that over time, you will begin to gain muscle protein. One of the important things to remember, however, is that very few people consume protein in a balanced fashion. In fact, in the North American diet, you can see that most people consume a small amount of protein at breakfast, a moderate amount of protein at the lunchtime meal, and their largest amount of protein at the last meal of the day. Of course, one of the areas that we haven't talked about, which we'll discuss later in the presentation, is this large bubble here in which breakdown is exceeding synthesis. And this is, of course, when we're sleeping, we're not eating anything. So the protein intake threshold for muscle protein synthesis to be completely fully stimulated may only be met, for example, in this young individual, twice per day. In an older individual, it's quite possible that they would only meet that protein threshold once per day. But there's an important point to remember. Every time that we perform resistance exercise, we get an anabolic window. But this window is open for a long time. This figure shows you, and just to remind you, that it may be open for as long as 2 days after you've performed a bout of resistance exercise or weightlifting. And this figure shows then that every time after performing resistance exercise, you get a stimulation of muscle protein synthesis when you ingest protein. This is a figure that's taken from some rather old data that I generated when I was a postdoc with Bob Wolf, showing you that even 48 hours after there was a stimulation of muscle protein synthesis after performing resistance exercise, and while breakdown went up, it was only a transient stimulation and returned to baseline levels at 48 hours. This is a meta-analysis conducted by Brad Schoenfeld, Alan Aragon, and Jim Krieger, and to make the point that when you do not adjust for total protein intake, you might conclude the overall effect of protein timing is superior when you place the timing of protein ingestion close to the resistance exercise workout in terms of stimulating hypertrophy. However, when you adjust for total daily protein intake, you can see that this effect disappears. So it's a small effect, and it really emphasizes that it's total daily protein intake that matters and not the timing relative to the exercise. What about the protein dose? How much protein can we consume at any one time, digest, and can our body use, and more specifically, can our muscle use and make use of to stimulate muscle protein synthesis? This is a figure from a study by Dan Moore when he was a PhD student working with me, and it shows you that in young men, after performing an intense bout of resistance exercise, that the stimulation of muscle protein synthesis increases up to a dose of about 20 grams and then plateaus. The dose of 20 grams, however, would show some variability. If you had a smaller athlete, they could require less protein. Conversely, a larger athlete with more muscle might require more protein. But quite simply, doubling the dose of protein up to 40 grams resulted in an additional 11% stimulation and was not statistically significantly different. When we take this 20-gram dose and we divide it by the body weight of the individuals in this study, you can see that the average protein intake per meal is around 1/4 of a gram or to 5 grams of protein per kilogram per meal to optimally or maximally stimulate protein synthesis. One of the questions that I get asked is, when are we at our longest period of muscle loss? And clearly we spend most of our waking hours assuming that we eat food throughout the day under the influence of our last meal. But once we've gone to bed and while we're sleeping, we're not consuming food. And so sleep could be a period in which you are actually losing a little bit of muscle mass. I show the results of this study as an interesting way to highlight what pre-sleep protein ingestion could do for younger individuals in terms of improving their muscle mass. This was a study performed by Tim Snyders. This is Tim right here, when he was working with Luc Van Loon. And you can see that in a group that consumed a protein-containing supplement, that they experienced, this group, almost 80% greater gain in quadricep muscle cross-sectional area as a measure of hypertrophy. Interestingly enough, when you look at the sum of the 1RM lifts in the protein-containing group, they got a greater increase than did the placebo-consuming group. So it may be that pre-sleep consumption of protein is an ideal way to regenerate and restore, and if you like, remodel the proteins that are damaged as a result of resistance exercise. So the recommendations we give to athletes to optimize the stimulation of muscle protein synthesis are to consume 4 meals, and that all of the meals contain a sufficient amount of protein to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis, like you can see here. But interestingly enough, one of the pieces of advice that we give to these athletes is to try and consume a pre-sleep protein-containing meal that would have to be a little bit larger, because the person is asleep for upwards of 8 to 10 hours, to provide a during sleep stimulation of muscle protein synthesis. So let's put this recommendation into some numbers that people can take away from the presentation. If we have 4 equally spaced protein-containing meals at about 0.3 grams of protein per kilogram per meal, so a little bit on the high side, but just to make sure that the process is fully stimulated. And then we have 1 pre-sleep meal that is larger at about 0.5 grams of protein per kilogram. Then for a large individual that weighs 120 kilograms, you can see that this person would be consuming 204 grams of protein per day, which would average out to about 1.7 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. Now we can make this recommendation scaled for body size for a 50 kilogram female cross-country runner. This individual would only require 85 grams of protein in a day, but it would still net out to require 1.7 grams of protein per kilogram. But importantly, meal spacing and timing are important. You can't get all of this protein in one meal and expect for it to be as effective as if you divided it into 3 or 4 meals throughout the day. And you need to consume an equivalent dose of protein at every meal. So it does require some planning. Some people ask why I would be concerned about providing more protein for a cross-country runner. What I will say is that these athletes expend a lot of energy, and that even a small amount of a large energy expenditure coming from protein would mean that they burn some amino acids, in particular the amino acid that is important, as you'll see, which is leucine, during the exercise bouts, and they still have to regenerate damaged tissue as a result of the exercise that they perform. So what is the active amino acid in all of the proteins that we're talking about? It's probably no surprise to most people that are listening that leucine, which is a branched chain amino acid, stimulates muscle protein synthesis. And it's as if without leucine, we can't actually turn the process of muscle protein synthesis on. We can see that leucine stimulates a centrally important protein in the anabolic pathway, which is known as mTOR. And we now have a good idea of the mechanism by which this amino acid actually works to stimulate the whole process of muscle protein synthesis. I'm just going to show you some studies to emphasize the important role of leucine, and this is a study performed by a former PhD student of mine. This is Tyler over here. You can see that there is a small dose of whey protein, a large dose of whey protein that should maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis, and then a small dose of whey protein to which we've added 5 grams of leucine. Similarly, here's a small dose of whey protein to which we've added all of the branched chain amino acids, so 5 grams of leucine plus isoleucine and valine. Quite simply, in the early part of after the ingestion of protein, every condition is stimulated. However, you can see that in the latter parts following exercise, that only the large dose of whey protein or the small dose of whey protein with added leucine are still stimulating a rise in muscle protein synthesis. Quite simply, the small dose of whey protein has returned and is almost back down to baseline, and the addition of the other 2 branched chain amino acids, we think, compete with leucine for entry into the cell, and so you do not get the same stimulation of muscle protein synthesis. This is to show you that the same effect is present in older individuals. These are data from older women. This is Michaela DeVries, the student who performed this work. And in this trial, we've simply integrated more leucine into the diets of these individuals by using a leucine-enriched beverage that these women consume twice daily. You can see that in the rested condition, the leucine stimulates a greater rise in muscle protein synthesis. In the exercise condition, whether you're in the control group or the leucine group, you always get a benefit of performing resistance exercise, but the leucine group saw a stimulation of muscle protein synthesis that was greater than that of the control group. The simple answer is that leucine works quite effectively in younger individuals and in older individuals. This has led us to propose what we call the leucine trigger hypothesis. And it goes something like this, that leucine has to reach an intracellular concentration to turn on muscle protein synthesis to its maximal effect. And if it doesn't, the stimulation of muscle protein synthesis is suboptimal. However, by the performance of exercise, we can see that this trigger threshold or concentration of leucine that's required is actually a little bit lower. However, the exercise effect is probably transient, although it may last up to, as we've said before, 24 to 48 hours. Conversely, if you're inactive, or if you're older, or if you have a disease, for example, like type 2 diabetes, then the trigger is higher and you require more leucine to turn the process on. This is to remind you that whey protein, here as an isolate or here as a concentrate, by comparison to soy proteins, which are shown here, or a pea protein here, a rice protein here, or collagen, the whey proteins are far more effective in terms of the leucine dose that they deliver. In fact, you would have to eat almost twice as much of these proteins and 4 times as much of the collagen to get the same amount of whey the same amount of leucine, as you would in the whey protein. I'm going to show you this trial, which is to make the point that the dose of whey protein in older individuals can be very effective. And when you compare it to the dose, the same dose in terms of protein as collagen, that these older women experienced a greater rise in muscle protein synthesis. So this is an older woman, and we're using a model of resistance exercise where these women exercise just one of their legs. And we're doing this over a period of 6 days. So this is the integrated muscle protein synthetic response. What you can see is that acutely, that whey protein outperforms collagen protein either in the fed state or with the performance of resistance exercise. And that effect is seen again over the 6 days of the protocol here in both the fed state. Remember, this is a leg that's simply at rest, and in a fed plus exercise leg. Quite simply, whey protein outperforms collagen protein in these older women. We saw a similar effect in this trial, which we reported earlier this year in Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise, in highly trained cyclists undergoing a period of overreaching in which they were engaging in a high volume of high intensity interval training. Quite simply, when you ingest whey protein, which in this case was a very pure fraction of whey protein versus collagen, you can see much greater rises in plasma leucine, much greater rises in all of the essential amino acids. And just remembering that collagen proteins are devoid of the amino acid tryptophan. What we observed was a pronounced stimulation of muscle protein synthesis that was much greater in the whey protein condition, and was greater still when we looked at a different fraction of proteins within the muscle, showing yet again that whey protein, mostly because of its leucine content, is the most effective protein to stimulate protein synthesis. So what have I told you this evening? Hopefully I've convinced you that changes in muscle protein synthesis are the predominant mechanism dictating changes in muscle mass. That the main stimuli for muscle protein synthesis are feeding, which is transient, and heavy loading, which is long-lasting, possibly lasting up to 2 days. But the timing of protein ingestion relative to exercise is maybe not unimportant, but it's certainly less important than a lot of people would have you believe. The pre-sleep protein may be an important feeding occasion to allow remodeling and reconditioning of skeletal muscle. But the main driver for muscle protein synthesis with feeding is actually the amino acid leucine. This is a key amino acid and doesn't actually require the other 2 branch chain amino acids. Proteins then rich in leucine are supporting greater rates of muscle protein synthesis, both acutely in the hours post-exercise and when we repeat this activity over a number of days. And that effect was seen in both young and older individuals. Whey, but not collagen, supports greater rates of muscle protein synthesis in younger persons during intensified periods of training, and this may become important when we consider athletes that are in training camps where very high volume and overreaching are employed by their coaches. So at this time, I think it's important for me to emphasize that there's no data to support the use of collagen supplements in support of muscle protein synthesis in older persons or in persons in catabolic or anabolic environments such as athletes. I'd like to say thank you very much for listening this evening, and hopefully I can answer some questions for you.
Fantastic presentation, Stuart. Really nice, very clear, and I think we all learned a lot from your slides and your talk as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a few questions that, as we mentioned before, we are going to handle your questions right after your presentation.
Sure.
And some of the questions that came up here, they of course, and I'm sure you're probably going to laugh at that because this is probably a recurrent question for you based on the documentary Game Changers, you know, which deals with the plant-based protein sources and whether it's possible to have an ideal protein synthesis in the muscle if you are on a vegan or on a vegetarian diet mainly.
Yeah, good question. So the question is, you know, are vegetable source proteins as effective? So I showed you the graph with respect to the leucine content of the proteins, and the answer is that you just have to eat more of the vegetable source proteins to get up to that leucine concentration. And just remember that the graph I showed you are pure proteins. Those are protein powders. So it's not the foods, it's the actual protein powders. And so the difference is that foods contain dietary fiber, which lowers the quality of the food in terms of providing the amino acids. So the answer is yes, you can do it with a vegetarian diet. You just have to eat a lot of vegetarian or vegetable source protein to do it. So you know, one of our collaborators, Hamilton Rochelle, and we have a paper that hopefully will come out soon and show you that as soon as you get to a protein intake of about 2 times the RDA or 1.6, it might not matter where you get your protein from. It's still pretty good, but it means you have to eat a lot of protein. So, and a lot of the protein that we used was purified protein powder. So it's the answer is yes, but you have to eat a lot.
Right. So probably these athletes would, of course, benefit from a supplement as well, maybe to offset this need for a higher consumption, right? This is interesting.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, supplements are in that category of athletes, particularly if they're in a period of very intense training, would be, I think, beneficial. And there are lots of athletes who are vegan and they say they do very well. I found that if you, that women, and particularly women who are endurance athletes, probably underconsume protein. And that would be the one group, because they have a very high energy expenditure, that I might think about protein supplements for sure.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So another question that showed up here is whether higher intensity strength training would allow for a higher protein intake. Is this relationship linear? I think you showed in one of your slides that there is a plateau where, you know, if you consume more, you don't necessarily get more protein synthesis. But what if you adjust the training intensity? Would that make up for it?
Yeah, that's a good question. We don't think that the intensity or the volume really has an effect. We've tested a number of fairly substantial protocols, and we've looked at protein metabolism, and it really, for most people, once you get up to about 1/4 gram per kilo, or maybe even a little bit higher, so say 0.3 grams per kilo of good dietary protein, you really can't get higher than that. And people need not to be confused with that your body can't digest more. It can digest lots of protein, but it's what you do with the protein that's important. So we look at the muscle response and not at how much you can digest, because your body can digest lots and lots of protein, but it's whether it can use it. So I think, you know, I want to say that we've never seen anything which would say very intense training, you need more. In fact, if there's any exercise that would increase your need for protein, it would be endurance exercise, because of the amino acids that you oxidize during the exercise itself.
Mm-hmm. One question here, Stuart, thanks for your answer, by the way, very thorough, is on collagen consumption and the impact that it might have in when an athlete is recovering from injury.
Yeah.
Whether collagen could be a good source, or you would still just focus on whey protein supplementation in that type of special period?
So the answer to that question is there are probably people that are out there that are better able to answer the question than me. But recovery from injury is, I think it's an art as well as a science. So I think trying to find the optimal combination of proteins, which is a great question, requires some very good science to be done. We don't have it just yet. Collagen might help in that situation. It certainly can't hurt, but still, when you think about a musculoskeletal injury, you're still rehabilitating the muscle and the connective tissue. So I think that maybe targeting the collagen for the connective tissue and thinking also about the soft tissue or the muscle tissue as well would not be a bad strategy. But great question. I wish I had the answer. I think there are probably some people that are better to answer it, but it might.
Right, right. So there is time for one more question here, and we have a question from Bianca. And she is asking one of those circadian cycles questions, which is, if she exercises, if she does like a exercise in the morning, what would be the best time of the day to consume branched chain amino acids?
Yeah, so I'm a morning exerciser as well. I think the answer for it is still the practical answer is still that if you exercise in the morning before you eat, they're trying to eat as close as possible to the performance of the exercise would restart that regenerative process. I don't think, and hopefully I convinced you a little bit, that the branched chain amino acids is the best way to go. Whole proteins with all of the essential amino acids with enough leucine is really the way to go. When you consume just the branched chains, they can only stimulate protein synthesis according to the amount of leucine, and the other two branched chain amino acids actually compete with leucine and reduce its effectiveness. So all of the essential amino acids, full proteins, food still does as good a job as any of the supplements that are out there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Stu. There is a storm of questions here on the Q&A, and it's of course, I mean, it's a great privilege for us from a Brazilian audience to have the opportunity to ask you these questions, and we would like to thank you for your availability to be with us, and we will continue now with Irineu. So I know you have limitations on your time, so if you can hold until the Q&A at the end, we can go back and debate again and answer more questions, but we understand that your time is limited. So thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you. Take care, everybody. Stay healthy.
Thank you very much.